In this video I'm going to attempt to explain some of the data that's in your NAPLAN results report that you would have all received last week. When you have a look at the front page, there is a little key here that explains basically the information in the band data that you can see on the right hand side of the page right about here. Let's have a look at that based on some actual results rather than the example. You would have got two documents. The first is Student Report 2013, and that will have summaries of your results under 4 different headings. So the first one we're going to look at is reading, and there's actually a key just up here that shows you what all these different marks and shaded areas actually mean. So let's have a look at that for this individual student. What it is showing is that this little black dot here is the band result, or where the student's result actually was for reading. The little black triangle here is showing you what the national average was for Year 7 students in reading, and the open triangle, or the white coloured triangle here, is showing you what the school's average was for reading for Year 7. The other thing that these graphical results will show you is where you are at compared to the rest of the state. So this light shaded box about halfway in the graph line there shows you that that's the range that the middle 60% of students, Year 7 students in Australia, actually achieved. So what does that mean? That means if you are above in this darker area, you're actually in the top 20%, and if you happen to be below in this area here, you didn't achieve at the range that the middle 60% of the state actually did. And so all of these actually work in the same way. So whether we're talking about language conventions or numeracy or the other two that were on the previous slide, all of those graphs work in the same way, and all of those little marks and indicators represent the same thing. The last page on the student report is a summary of assessed skills. And so for each band level, it describes for you what sort of things that you have demonstrated you're able to do if you have achieved that band. So a band 9 in reading here is described as being able to do all of these things, and that was based on the results that you got for the reading questions in the NAPLAN test. So before we start looking at some of the really useful information that these NAPLAN reports actually give you about your own performance in literacy and numeracy, I just wanted to explain the purpose of actually going through this today. Why we are giving you a chance as the learner to have a look at these NAPLAN results. There's really a number of reasons why we're doing this. The first reason is so that you can have a look at where you're at in terms of what are my strengths, what am I good at in reading, in writing, in language conventions. The second thing we want you to be thinking about is where can I improve? What are the things that I have not been able to do this time around in this one particular test? And therefore, what are the areas that I maybe should be focusing on if I'm thinking about improving my literacy? The third thing we want you to be able to do by the end of today's session is to formulate some goals. What are my goals for my literacy learning next year? In other words, what am I going to try and improve? And the final thing that we want you to try and be able to do by the end of today is to think about, well, how am I going to achieve those goals? What are some of the strategies that I can put into place as part of my learning to try and improve upon these things that I've identified myself as being areas that I can improve in? So with that in mind, let's have a look at probably the easiest column to understand, which is the reading column. So we're starting with this area here. The first thing I need to do is to explain to you how it's actually set up. So you'll notice that the column is quite long, and that the question numbers, which are just here, appear to be in no particular order. They are actually put in order of how difficult they were. And that makes more sense when you have a look at this second column of numbers in the middle here, which is the percentage of the state that got this question correct. So how it's actually set up is the questions that right at the bottom here were the easiest questions for Year 7 students to be able to get correct. And as we move up the column, the questions increased in difficulty. And so what this is saying or suggesting is that question number 6 in the reading section was the hardest question for Year 7 students to do. And that's based on the fact that only 18% of students in the state actually managed to get that question correct. The second thing you'll notice is that the column is actually split up on two sides, and that's based on what you got correct and what you didn't actually manage to get correct. So on this side of the column, these are all the questions that this particular student got correct, and there's a description of the types of things that this student was able to do. So when you're looking at your own results, what you're going to be doing in terms of identifying your strengths is having a look and seeing if there's any patterns here. So for example, this student is good at interpreting information that's in the text and identifying main ideas and the purposes of choosing certain words. On this side then are all of the questions that this particular student didn't happen to get correct. So when it comes time to actually filling out in the template the areas that I could possibly improve upon, this is where you're going to be getting the majority of that information from. This year you were also assessed on persuasive writing, and I want to have a look at that now because this is actually quite a complicated column. There's a lot of useful information in here, but you really need to understand what you're looking at. So we're going to start by looking at the persuasive writing column and how it's similar to the reading column, and then I'll talk to you about some of the differences. So the first thing that's similar is, again, the questions are organized in decreasing degree of difficulty. In other words, all of the easy questions start at the bottom. And what you can see here, for example, is that 99%, 98%, 96% of students were able to do all of these things, which is some of the different skills that were assessed in your persuasive writing at a very basic level. And so then again, as you move up the column, things get harder and harder to the point where when we get up to these top ones here, only 1%, 2%, 3%, 5% of the entire state managed to earn the highest marks for these different categories. The thing that is actually quite confusing is this column here. And so that's what I want to talk to you about for a minute. Instead of a question number, you'll notice that the column heading here says CR number, which actually stands for a criteria number. And you'll see that they all start with a W, which means writing, but then there are a couple of other digits behind it. So if I can actually just get in here, for example, we've got W10.4. Now what does that mean? On its own it doesn't mean anything, so what we need to do is have a look at the criteria and see what W10.4 actually refers to, and that's what we're going to do now. So this is the marking criteria that was used to determine how well you actually achieved the criteria for the persuasive writing task in this year's NAPLAN test. And these are the numbers of the criteria here, and they correspond to these numbers on your actual results page. So for example, writing criteria number 1 is audience. How well did you engage and persuade the reader? How well did you target your writing to the intended audience? Criteria number 8, which would be W8 on your persuasive writing results, is sentence structure. How well did you actually produce grammatically correct, meaningful sentences? And W10, which is the one we're going to be focusing on here, is spelling. How accurately did you spell the words, and did you actually spell all your words correct because they were easy words, or did you use some difficult words? So that actually only explains the first digit in this column here of criteria for your persuasive writing task. So the number that comes after the decimal point, what does that number actually mean? That's explained for us here in terms of the number of points that were available for each criteria. So if we have a look at spelling, it's telling you that you could have scored a range of points in spelling from 0 to 6. And that's what we need to keep in mind when we are looking at the persuasive writing column. So we're going to do that now. So this student's results show that there are a number of points that were earned for spelling, criteria number 10, but it got to a certain level and this student didn't actually earn any more points. So let's have a look at how that actually breaks down. Right down the bottom here, if we look for the first W10, which is spelling, we'll find it. Oh, that's not it. Let me just zoom in a little bit more here. W10.1, here we are here. 99% of students in the state got at least 1 mark for spelling words correctly. And this student is in the same boat. He spelled all his simple words correctly and actually did a little bit better than that because he also got the 2nd mark out of 6 for spelling most simple and some common words correctly. And if we look further up as it gets a little bit more difficult, here is where the 3rd mark would have been earned for spelling. W10, criteria number 10 is spelling. Point 3 means he earned the 3rd mark out of 6 for spelling some simple and common words correctly, as did 94% of the state. Now, for this particular student, that is where his marks stopped for spelling, because as we can see here, the next mark, the 4th mark out of 6 here, is in the incorrect column. So some of the difficult words that he used in his writing task were not spelled correctly, and therefore he also would not have earned the 5th and the 6th mark for spelling. So what does this mean? He didn't manage to demonstrate this skill here, at least 10 difficult words spelled correctly. That means that less than 10 difficult words were spelled correctly by the student in this particular task. What does that mean? Does it mean that this person is bad at spelling? Well, not necessarily, because if you have a look at where he's at compared to the rest of the state, only 19%, or about 1/5 of students in the state, managed to actually earn the 5th mark out of 6 for spelling. So, it sounds complicated, but once you understand how this column actually works, it's quite easy to see and have a look at where you're at. Overall, because we know it's organised from easiest to hardest, this student will be able to see straight away, well, in terms of all 10 criteria, I'm actually doing everything right at a certain level. So I'm earning at least 1 or 2 or 3 marks for all 10 criteria. What do I need to focus on then? Well, as you would expect, when you get up to the top here and only a very small percentage of students are getting these things right, the criteria get very difficult. It is actually quite hard to earn full marks in this task. It's not impossible, but very few students actually manage to do it. So looking at this as an overall picture of ability to write persuasively, this student has earned, the majority of the marks that were available, which is nice. But the first thing that was actually not achieved was this one here, spelling. Only 3 out of 6 correct. So perhaps that might be a goal for this student for next year would be to work on his or her skills in spelling and think about, well, what could some of the ways be that I can actually focus on my spelling? And of course, your teachers will be there to help you with that next year. So the criteria works the same way for all 10 different areas that were assessed. And so basically, when you look at your results, you'll be looking at it in the same way as I've just explained for spelling. So for example, paragraphing here is criteria number 7. So wherever it says W7 in your results is referring to that skill, paragraphing. And if you have a look down the bottom here, paragraphing was only worth 3 points. So if you got W7 2 correct, it means you got 2 out of 3 for paragraphing. And if you got W7 3 in the incorrect column, it means you didn't earn the 3rd mark available for paragraphing. The last 2 columns on your additional report with all this extra information are under the heading language conventions, and that's referring to, in this case, spelling and grammar and punctuation. So this one is set up the same way as reading, really. You've got questions arranged again from the easiest ones down the bottom here for spelling to the hardest ones. And in terms of questions that you got correct, they are all listed in this column here, and questions that you did not get correct or did not attempt are here. And so when it comes time for you to think about, well, how am I going with my spelling, it will tell you which words you were able to spell, which words you didn't actually spell correctly, and you can compare that to the rest of the state by looking at this column here. How many or what percentage of students in Year 7 actually got it right? So this particular student actually got some difficult words correct, or words that the majority of students actually found difficult or didn't spell correctly. Only 33% of students got this word correct, and this student was one of them. But he or she also actually got some words correct that the rest of the state found fairly easy. So this one here, 77% of students spelled the word average correctly, and that for some reason this student actually didn't manage to do that. Grammar and punctuation is set up in the same way. So easiest questions at the bottom, hardest questions at the top. This is the percentage of people that got it correct. This is the question number. These are the ones that this student got correct. And these are the ones that this student didn't manage to get correct. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that there is a little number or a little asterisk next to the incorrect responses. There's asterisks next to all of the ones in this spelling column, and there's a number 1 here and a number 3 here. What does all that mean? It basically means it's trying to explain, well, what did you do when you got that wrong? So this one is saying that the student chose option number 1, which was an incorrect answer. This one here is saying that the student chose option number 3, which was not one of the correct options. The asterisks are a little bit more complicated, and you might actually have to think about, well, do I remember that question and what I did? Because what the asterisk actually means is that student either didn't give one of the expected responses, or may have actually given more than one response. So that might have been something like, I picked an answer and then I decided to change my mind and I forgot to rub the other one out. Or it could be that one of the options that you chose wasn't clear. So it's a little bit harder to understand what the asterisk means, but unless you're looking at the question paper, that's actually not very important in any case. So that's my attempt at explaining everything that is there for you to look at on your NAPLAN results. A member of the literacy team now will answer any questions that you might have about your individual results, and you will also be given some time to have a look through your results and try and identify the areas of strength, areas that you can possibly improve upon, set some goals for next year in terms of improving your literacy, and also talk to your teachers or the literacy team member in your room right now about some strategies that you might be able to use to improve the areas that you have identified as being able to be improved. Thanks for listening.